And we're pleased to welcome to our studios Gordon Chang, the columnist for Forbes.com, and I'm very happy to have you in that chair because most of the time you're on this program, you're via satellite. So nice to have you here.
Thank you so much.
And we always, at least mostly in the past, have talked about China. Today we're going to mix it up a bit and talk about North Korea because it's in the news so much these days. Let's talk about what happened with this. Was it a missile or a satellite, Gordon? What do you think?
It doesn't really matter because the same thing that puts a satellite in orbit also puts a warhead on target. So, it's the launcher is the launcher. They're virtually identical.
Doesn't matter from that point of view then?
It doesn't matter. And the 2009 Security Council resolution specifically prohibits North Korea from using any ballistic missile technology and testing it. So whether it was a satellite on top of that launcher or whatever, it was a violation of Resolution 1874.
One of the things we do know, because they fessed up to it, was that it failed.
Right.
Now, why would they, this is not a regime that tends to sort of proclaim its failures to the world, so why would they announce that?
Well, they actually had to because they invited reporters from 50 countries to the launch site. So they were all in country. And so there was no hiding this one. So at the end of the day, the regime had to open up a little bit and had to admit it.
Is this failure, in your view, an indication of this regime's ineptitude?
Well, in a sense it is, because everyone was expecting it to be a success because they had 3 prior failures. But on the other hand, even countries that are developed and have extremely good missile programs often have failures. For instance, the United States, about 7-8 years ago, had a string of 4 or 5 launches that didn't work. And so, yeah, the North Koreans are learning. But North Koreans are going to learn as much or more from their failures than from their successes. And eventually they're going to get it right, and they will have a launcher that will be able to put a warhead into the continental North America.
Okay, but not yet. So what does it say about their military preparedness today?
Well, it says that they are not able to launch a warhead into North America, but they don't need that. All they really need is a Toyota pickup truck and drive it into the center of some city. And that's a scenario that American security planners worry about, that they do that and eventually they have a North Korean call up the White House and say, I'd like to talk to the president.
If that's the nightmare scenario, then why waste time with all of this, missile launching and having this kind of capability when you're right, a truck in a Times Square would do the job just as fine?
I think there are a couple of things. First of all, it is so psychological for them to have a long-range launcher along with a warhead of some sort. So clearly, it is going to be a weapon that is usable, especially if they have a mobile launcher, which they showed us on April 15th in that big parade in Kim Il-sung Square. So yes, it's important to have a weapon, but it's also psychological because it does terrorize us.
This didn't work. What do you think they're likely to follow up with?
Well, everyone says, and I think that it's absolutely right, that there will be a nuclear detonation soon. South Korean intelligence passed along some satellite photos that showed that the North Koreans were excavating earth from the site where they had their 2 prior nuclear detonations. So this is coming, and it's going to come fairly soon.
They just announced as well, the North Koreans did, that they are perfectly capable of reducing, I think they said, South Korea's government to ashes in less than 4 minutes. Why do you think they felt a need to put that on the record?
Well, I think it's because they had the failed launch. That was really a humiliating failure for Kim Jong Un, the new leader. And so they need to have some sort of success. And unfortunately, in the North Korean context, a success is something that's going to terrorize us. And this warning that North Korea issued is really specific. It's not just we're going to turn Seoul into a sea of fire, which we've heard before, but he made a very specific threat against President Lee Myung-bak of South Korea, plus also members of the South Korean government. So this was very specific. This was unusual. And so therefore it is creating alarm all over not only South Korea, but also in the United States.
Not to be too flippant about this, but as you pointed out, there's a new kid in town, a new Kim in charge of North Korea, and I wonder how much this missile launch was wrapped up in his own, well, let's start with this, his own efforts to consolidate power.
Well, I think that it certainly is going to hurt that because when Kim Jong-il was alive, his father, they used the sinking of the Cheonan, the South Korean frigate, in March of 2010, and the shelling of the South Korean island in November of 2010, and they credited that to Kim Jong Un, the current leader, to show his ability to be the North Korean dictator. So a failed missile launch isn't going to help, and that's why there's going to be another provocation of some sort, certainly a nuclear detonation, and maybe an attack on South Korea.
When he took over, Kim Jong Un, we got this sort of orgy of odd publicity at the beginning. You know, he's young, he's Western educated,
Right.
he's going to be different from his father. We should sort of read into him this potential of a new opening in relations between us and them. How much of all of that or any of that did you buy?
Well, we don't really need to know what Kim Jong Un thinks. The important thing is that he's in the context of a North Korean regime that is going to force him to act and think in certain ways. And so, yes, I mean, it was nice that he was educated in the West, unlike his father and grandfather. But nonetheless, that doesn't really mean very much because he's in that collective decision-making system right now where the military dominates. And if he wants to survive, he's going to have to sort of follow the tune of the military and some very senior members of the regime. So it doesn't really matter where he was educated.
So he's in charge, but not really.
Well, yes, because he only had about 2 years. Kim Jong-il spent only about 2 years grooming Kim Jong-un to be dictator, whereas Kim Il-sung spent more than 20 years getting Kim Jong-il ready. And the North Korean regime, we think of it as a monolith, but really there's a lot of different components. There's the Kim family, there's the security services, the Korean Workers' Party, but most important, there's the North Korean military. And he has to balance all of those factions and make sure that most everybody is happy. Because if he doesn't do that, if he gets the balance wrong, then there's going to be all sorts of problems, and it could mean the end of his regime and end of his life. So he really needs some quiet time to be able to learn how to get all these factions together, get them working, and to make sure that he puts his people into place.
Can I just understand what you said? You said could be the end of his life if he doesn't play that right, as
Sure.
in they might kill him?
Yeah, I mean, there have been a number of deaths in the last couple of years, and those were suspected to be in connection with people who lost out in political struggles. So the failure in North Korea's very rough game of politics often is death. Now, Kim Jong-un, he needs to be there in a sense because the military sees the Kim family as sort of legitimizing military rule. So there's a lot of incentive not to knock him off. But you never know whether some young colonel gets the idea that he really wants to be the next leader. And this is a very tough regime to survive in.
So he's nothing more than a figurehead then?
Well, at the present time, he probably is little more than a figurehead, but as time goes on, he'll be able to consolidate his position, and he'll be able to act like his father did and his grandfather did. So it's a question of time. And the important thing is to watch not only his public moves, but what happens in terms of reorganizations in the military and in the security services, because that'll give us some hint of whether he's been able to sort of put his own people into place.
I know that, you know, this is a very shadowy family and we don't know that much about them, but do we know if he has siblings or cousins whereby if it doesn't work out with him, they can still keep it all in the family? There's somebody else out there?
Well, there's 2 older brothers, and you know, there's a lot of probably illegitimate, or even, I should say, even more illegitimate children. Kim Jong-nam, the oldest child, is now being warehoused by Beijing. He lives in Macau. He walks around without security, which is an indication that the Chinese leaders have told the North Korean ones, keep your hands off Kim Jong-nam. And the reason why I think Beijing is doing that is because if it ever sees the need to insert its own leader into Pyongyang, Kim Jong-nam would be very convenient for that because he still has ambitions, despite the fact that he says he doesn't. He still has ambitions to rule North Korea. And so he is a potential competitor to Kim Jong-un.
Now, this is interesting because the current office holder, we don't know exactly how old he is, but he's in his 20s, right?
Right,
Something
28,
like that?
29.
How is a guy that young and apparently not that experienced
Right.
in all of these areas, how is he supposed to consolidate power among all these different factions?
That's a great question. I mean, he has Jong Song-tak, who is Kim Jong-il's brother-in-law, because he's married to Kim Jong-il's sister. Many people call him the regent. Kim Jong-il's sister, Kim Kwang-hoi, is also very, very powerful in its own right. And so those two could actually protect Kim Jong-un. The real danger for Kim Jong-un, of course, is that Jong Song-tak or someone says that they really don't want to be the regent. They really want to be the ruler of North Korea. And so they sort of sideline Kim Jong-un. But this is going to be very, very difficult. And you're right. His hold on power right now is fragile. He just needs time to be able to get himself to where he needs to be and be his own man, so to speak.
Let's take the sort of what they call the 35,000 feet view from up top here. The world is spending a lot of time and attention these days trying to figure out how to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons and keep them, quote unquote, contained or in a box. Can we take that approach with North Korea?
Well, those two countries are linked because North Korea and Iran have been running joint missile and nuclear weapons programs for more than a decade. Iranian observers were on site for all the missile and nuclear detonations of North Korea. So if we want to stop Iran, we should stop North Korea first. And so if we have a resolute and a nuanced response to North Korea that actually is able to push them in the right direction or get rid of the regime, the Iranians are going to say, oh my gosh, we now got to play ball with the international community. But if we're not very good in terms of getting North Korea to move in the right direction, then the Iranians are going to see a big green light for their own ambition. So these two countries are really connected.
But the trouble is the North Koreans already have nukes, the Iranians don't. So
right.
We can't really push them around the way that we're trying to push around Iran right now.
Yeah, but nukes didn't save the Soviet Union, a much more fearsome competitor than North Korea. And so we have much more leverage over the North Koreans than people think.
Okay, let me read something that you wrote for CNN.com, and it's about food. Food aid, you wrote, if distributed properly, can undermine Kim Jong Un's still fragile grip. The three Kim rulers have maintained power by keeping the North Korean people sealed off from the rest of the world so that their propaganda would remain believable. Food aid, if properly monitored, can help end this control on information. Food monitors, present in the country to ensure no diversion of aid, give the North Korean people an opportunity to meet outsiders and thereby get a different perspective on the world and on their own society. Just flesh that out for us a little bit. Food aid undermining the regime. If that's the case, should the Obama administration be withholding it?
They shouldn't have been withholding it. And that was the first reaction, of course, of the administration was to cancel the nutritional assistance after North Korea fired its long-range missile. But I actually think that our reaction should have been exactly the opposite because, once we put monitors into North Korea, we get to speak to the North Korean people directly. We get to speak to North Korean officials directly, people that we have no chance to have any contact with otherwise. And, if we have monitors in North Korea, that they have to be minded by North Korean officials who have to travel around their country and for the first time see some of the failures of their own system of governance. And so this has really been very difficult for the regime. And that's why both Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un have rejected international food aid when it's come with monitoring, because they just know how dangerous it is for the regime.
Is there really that much value in having presence on the ground and actual person-to-person contact?
Oh, I think that it's absolutely critical because we don't have it now. And that's part of the problem, in that we don't know a lot about North Korea because we just don't have that contact that we did, for instance, that we had with the Soviet Union, that we have with China and other countries. So this has really been a problem for us.
North Korea does the missile launch. It fails. The UN, in its response, decides to look at new sanctions because of the missile launch. Why such a harsh reaction to something that, at the end of the day, didn't work?
Well, because the way to deal and the time to deal with North Korea is before they get a functioning ballistic missile. And really, we had a lesson that the time to deal with North Korea was before they detonated their first nuclear device in 2006. Now we're sort of in a much more difficult position to deal with North Korea. But at least, they don't have a long-range missile now that is reliable. Now's the time to really concentrate on making sure that they don't.
So are we too late in terms of new sanctions and the possible bite that they might have?
No, I think that if we put into place the sanctions that the Bush administration imposed in 2005, cut North Korea off from the global financial system, that really had an effect on North Korea because North Korean diplomats had to ferry cash around in suitcases for a couple years. But those sanctions were prematurely lifted in 2007 at the behest of Beijing. And the other thing that we need to do, and this is important, is we need to sanction those financial institutions that have been involved in North Korea's sales of ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons to countries like Iran. Because if we do that, we're going to get the attention of people in Beijing because largely these are Chinese financial institutions that have been involved in this very deadly trade.
Let's finish up on Beijing. Do you see any signs that the Chinese are starting to get somewhat a loss of patience, let's say, with this rather unusual ally of theirs?
Yeah, there have been those signs for quite a long time. The problem right now is that China is going through really very severe troubles. The Communist Party is fracturing, the military is breaking free of civilian control. And we sort of look to Beijing to try to rein in North Korea, but Beijing right now is not in a position really, I think, to really focus in on North Korea. They've got so many internal problems right now.
Gordon, it's always good of you to visit TVO, but particularly in person in our studio. Thanks so much for being here tonight.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.